The stem of my wine glass felt slippery in my hand as my boss leaned in, smiling like a man delivering good news. "Chris will be getting the promotion. You'll still be a great support to him," he said. Him, the junior hire I'd been training for months. I could feel my cheeks flush, but the restaurant's soft lighting masked it. The only thought in my head was, why bring me here for this? My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. The expensive steak suddenly tasted like cardboard. Around us, other diners chatted happily, completely unaware that my world was crumbling at table 12. My boss, Kevin, kept talking about team dynamics and fresh perspectives, but all I heard was the sound of my 9-year career hitting a brick wall. The waiter refilled my wine glass, and I noticed my hand trembling slightly as I reached for it. Kevin didn't seem to notice. He was too busy explaining why this decision was best for everyone involved. The irony of celebrating my demotion over a $100 meal wasn't lost on me. I forced myself to nod and smile. This wasn't the time or place to fall apart. But inside, something cold and calculating was already stirring. If Kevin thought this conversation was over, he was dead wrong. I was already 3 moves ahead, planning something he'd never see coming. The game had just begun. I forced a polite laugh, the kind that hides how your throat feels like it's closing. The golden boy sat at the next table with another group, his voice carrying as he bragged about some client call I'd actually led. My boss kept talking about team spirit and mentorship, but every word felt like a slap. "Chris brings such energy to the team," Kevin continued, cutting into his salmon. "And with your experience guiding him, I know you two will make an unstoppable combination." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to teach my replacement how to do my job. The restaurant's jazz music played softly in the background, a soundtrack to my professional humiliation. I watched Kevin's face as he spoke, looking for any sign that he understood what he was really asking of me. There was none, just the confident expression of a man who believed he was solving problems rather than creating them. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I chewed my food slowly and planned my escape, mentally, not physically. Every smile I gave Kevin was calculated. Every nod was strategic. He thought he was delivering news. I knew he was handing me ammunition. This dinner would be the biggest mistake of his career, and he had no idea why. "My name is Amanda Keene, 34 years old, project manager at a mid-size marketing agency in Chicago. I've spent 9 years at this company, climbing rung by rung without missing a beat. I've covered for vacations, pulled late nights, fixed mistakes that weren't mine. I didn't just want this promotion. I had earned it with every cell in my body. I started here fresh out of college, with nothing but determination and a business degree. While other people played office politics, I focused on results. My campaigns brought in millions. My client relationships were rock solid. My team respected me because I never threw anyone under the bus, even when it would have been easy. I'd watched colleagues come and go, some promoted beyond their abilities, others overlooked despite their talents. I thought I understood the rules of advancement. Work hard, deliver results, be reliable. I'd followed that formula perfectly for nearly a decade, believing that excellence would eventually be rewarded with recognition. But tonight, sitting across from Kevin in this overpriced restaurant, I learned that none of that mattered. The promotion was never really mine to get. It had been promised to someone else before I even knew I was competing. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't just losing a job title. I was losing my faith in fairness, and that made me dangerous. Halfway through the meal, my boss dropped another bomb. "Oh, and starting next quarter, we'll transition the Stevenson account over to Chris," he said, like he was telling me the weather. The Stevenson account was my pride, my proof, my reason for being noticed. I'd built that relationship from nothing into a $1 million partnership. My smile froze, but inside, I was already rewriting my role in this game. The Stevenson account wasn't just business, it was personal. I knew every detail of their company, from the CEO's coffee preferences to their daughter's graduation date. I'd spent 2 years building trust that couldn't be replaced overnight. Kevin continued eating as if he hadn't just stripped away my most significant professional achievement. He talked about knowledge transfer and development opportunities for Chris, completely missing the fact that he was handing over relationships that had taken years to cultivate. Some things couldn't be transferred in a PowerPoint presentation. That makes sense, I heard myself say. Chris will need a strong foundation to work from. Kevin nodded, pleased with my response. He had no idea that I was already thinking months ahead. If he wanted to hand over my life's work to an inexperienced newcomer, I'd make sure Chris earned every painful lesson that came with it. Some education can't be taught. It has to be survived. I nodded, told him I understood, and even thanked him for trusting me with the transition. My boss's eyes softened, clearly mistaking my composure for compliance. But as he spoke about timelines and logistics, I realized he thought he'd won, that this was over. I knew you'd be professional about this, Kevin said, raising his glass. To new beginnings and continued success. I clinked my glass against his, watching the wine swirl like blood and water. He thought we were toasting my acceptance. I was toasting his downfall. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Kevin had brought me here, thinking he was managing a difficult conversation smoothly. He probably went home that night, proud of how well he'd handled breaking the news to me. He had no idea that his careful planning had just backfired spectacularly. That was the first time I felt the flicker of satisfaction, knowing he wouldn't see me coming. I was already thinking months ahead, mapping out a strategy that would make tonight's conversation look like child's play. Kevin had given me something invaluable without realizing it. Clarity. I now knew exactly who I was dealing with and exactly what I needed to do about it. This wasn't just about a promotion anymore. It was about respect. The city lights blurred outside my Uber window. My phone buzzed with a text from Chris. Thanks for all your help these past months. Couldn't have done it without you. I stared at it until the screen went dark. The message felt like salt in an open wound, even though I knew he probably meant it genuinely. It wasn't his fault entirely, but he was about to learn a hard truth. Opportunists rarely get to keep what they've been handed. And I wasn't about to beg for scraps. The old Amanda might have fought for fairness or appealed to HR. The new Amanda understood that fairness was something you created, not something you waited for. The driver made small talk about the weather, but I barely heard him. My mind was racing through possibilities, calculating risks and rewards. Every block we passed was another minute to plan my next move. By the time we reached my neighborhood, I'd already decided that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. By the time I reached my apartment, my mind was crystal clear. I wouldn't fight Kevin's decision. I wouldn't complain to anyone. Instead, I'd let Chris have exactly what he wanted. The full responsibility of managing a client relationship he didn't understand. Sometimes the best way to prove someone's incompetence is to give them exactly what they ask for and watch them hang themselves with it. A few months earlier, I'd been told in a one-on-one that I was being considered for the senior manager position. Kevin had closed his office door and spoken in the hushed tones reserved for important news. Every project I touched was flawless. Every client email came back glowing. I stayed late, mentored new hires, and thought I was building goodwill. "You're definitely in the running," he'd said, reviewing my performance metrics. "Keep doing what you're doing, and I think you'll be very happy with where this leads." I'd left that meeting walking on air, already mentally planning how I'd use the additional authority to improve our processes. I remember calling my sister that night, excited about the possibility of finally being recognized for my contributions. I'd started researching leadership training programs and thinking about the team changes I'd make. The promotion felt so close I could taste it, which made tonight's revelation even more bitter. Looking back, I could see all the signs I'd missed. The way Kevin's eyes didn't quite meet mine when he talked about my bright future. The vague timeline he gave for the decision. The way he changed the subject whenever I asked about next steps. I didn't know then that the decision had already been made. While I was working overtime to prove myself worthy, Chris was already being groomed for the role in private conversations I wasn't invited to. The consideration was just Kevin's way of keeping me motivated while he prepared his real choice. I'd been played from day one, and I was too focused on excellence to see the game being played around me. Chris arrived, fresh from a smaller agency, full of charm and overconfidence. He had the kind of easy smile that made people forget he hadn't actually accomplished anything yet. I was told to show him the ropes, and at first, I didn't mind. I genuinely enjoyed helping people succeed. But soon, I noticed my boss looping Chris into client meetings he had no reason to attend. His name started showing up on credit slides that should have had mine. When I mentioned it to Kevin, he brushed it off as cross-training and building bench strength. I thought it was temporary preparation for future accounts. Chris had a way of making himself memorable in meetings without actually contributing much substance. He'd ask one insightful question that made everyone nod appreciatively, then coast on that impression for the rest of the discussion. It was a skill I'd never mastered, making a big impact with minimal effort. The other colleagues seemed charmed by his enthusiasm and fresh perspective. They didn't notice that his ideas were usually variations of strategies I'd already proposed, or that his insights came from conversations we'd had the day before. He was good at making my knowledge sound like his innovation. Chris seemed grateful for my guidance, always asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. He'd thank me after every meeting, tell me how much he was learning. I actually liked him as a person, which made everything more complicated. It would have been easier to hate him if he'd been obviously manipulative. Instead, he was just ambitious and willing to accept opportunities that should have been mine. That made him dangerous in a completely different way. 2 weeks before the dinner, I overheard Chris telling another colleague about taking over my accounts. He laughed, like it was already set in stone, describing plans for campaigns I'd developed. My stomach turned, but I brushed it off. There hadn't been an official announcement. Maybe he was just being overly optimistic about his future responsibilities. Still, something in his tone made me uneasy. He wasn't speculating about possibilities, he was discussing certainties. He mentioned specific transition dates and budget allocations that I hadn't been told about. Either Chris was delusional about his prospects, or there were conversations happening that I wasn't part of. The conversation I'd overheard happened by the coffee machine, where office gossip traditionally flowed as freely as caffeine. Chris didn't see me approaching from behind the supply closet. His voice carried that confident tone of someone sharing insider information, not someone making wishful thinking statements about his career prospects. I started paying closer attention to office dynamics. Kevin's calendar seemed to have a lot of strategic planning meetings that didn't include me. Chris was staying late more often. Not because he had work to finish, but because he was in extended conversations with leadership. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. Now, sitting in that restaurant, I realized Chris hadn't been bragging. He'd been telling the truth. He'd known what I was about to learn weeks before Kevin told me. That night after the dinner, I didn't cry. I didn't vent to friends or write angry emails I'd never send. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and wrote one sentence in my notebook. Make yourself irreplaceable to the client, not the company. If the Stevenson account depended on me personally, Kevin couldn't just cut me out without consequences. This wasn't going to be a fight in the open, it was going to be chess. Every move would be calculated, every outcome planned 3 steps ahead. I wouldn't sabotage Chris directly or do anything that could be traced back to me. Instead, I'd create a situation where his failure was inevitable and my value was undeniable. I made myself another cup of coffee, stronger this time, and settled in for a long night of strategic planning. This required careful thought, not emotional reaction. I needed to understand every angle, every potential consequence, every possible outcome. One mistake could ruin everything I was trying to build. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of my laptop and the occasional car passing outside. I felt completely calm for the first time since that dinner conversation began. I had a plan now, a path forward that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or recognition. I opened my laptop and pulled up every email, every meeting note, every piece of communication I'd had with Stevenson over the past 2 years. I mapped out their organizational chart, their decision makers, their pain points, and their goals. By the time I went to bed at 2 a.m., I had a strategy that would make Kevin's dinner announcement look like the opening move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. I scheduled a catch-up call with the Stevenson team the next day. Nothing official, just Amanda checking in on how things were going. I listened more than I talked, asking about their goals, frustrations, and future plans. They were happy to chat, always appreciative of my attention to their needs. During the call, I offered them sneak previews of campaign ideas before Kevin or Chris even knew they existed. "I've been thinking about your Q2 launch," I said casually. "What if we approached it from a completely different angle?" I sketched out concepts that I knew would excite them, building anticipation for solutions only I could deliver. By the end of the conversation, they were emailing me directly for everything. Not Kevin, not Chris, me. That email chain would become my lifeline, a direct channel of communication that bypassed the office hierarchy entirely. Every message was professional, every interaction was valuable to them. I wasn't being manipulative. I was being indispensable. There's a difference, and it mattered more than Kevin would ever understand. Over the next month, I memorized every detail of Stevenson's preferences. The CEO's favorite wine for client dinners, the marketing director's kids' college choice, the product launch dates they'd never mentioned publicly. I wasn't manipulating. I was showing them I valued their success as much as they did. I started sending them industry articles that weren't directly related to our campaigns, but were relevant to their business challenges. I remembered their company anniversaries and sent congratulations. When their competitor made a major announcement, I was the first to call with strategic insights about how they could respond. Slowly, my name became synonymous with reliability and insight. When they had questions, they called me. When they needed advice, they trusted my judgment. When they planned their future, they assumed I'd be part of it. Chris was still learning their names while I was becoming part of their extended team. The foundation I was building would be impossible for him to replicate, because it was based on 2 years of genuine relationship building that couldn't be faked or fast-tracked. When Chris asked me for advice on a proposal, I gave it freely, just not the final polished version. I shared the general strategy, but left out a few key insights I knew the client valued. It wasn't sabotage, it was simply incomplete mentoring. He'd have to learn some lessons the hard way. When the client pushed back on his plan, Chris looked unprepared and flustered. He'd followed my advice, but without the nuanced understanding that comes from years of relationship building, his presentation felt generic and tone-deaf. The client was polite, but clearly unimpressed with his lack of insight into their specific needs. Kevin had to step in during the meeting, apologizing for the miscommunication and promising a revised approach. I watched from the corner of the conference room as Chris's confidence deflated in real time. No one suspected me of anything. I'd been nothing but supportive and professional. This was simply his proving ground, and he was failing on his own merits. The difference between knowing about a client and truly understanding them was becoming painfully obvious to everyone in the room. My boss pulled me aside one Friday afternoon. "You're making Chris nervous," he said with a half-smile. "Maybe ease up a little. Let him find his footing." The comment told me everything I needed to know. Chris had complained to Kevin about feeling overwhelmed or underprepared. That meant my strategy was working. I nodded and promised I would step back. "I want him to succeed," I said sincerely. "Maybe I have been a bit too hands-on with the transition." Kevin seemed relieved by my response, probably thinking he'd solved a personnel issue before it became a bigger problem. But I knew Chris wasn't nervous because of me. He was nervous because without my constant guidance, he had no footing to stand on. The Stevenson account required institutional knowledge that couldn't be downloaded in a few training sessions. It required relationships that had been built conversation by conversation over months and years. Soon, that would be obvious to everyone, not just me. Kevin's request to ease up was actually permission to let Chris fail more visibly. I invited the Stevenson team for an informal coffee catch-up when they visited Chicago the following week. No agenda, no sales pitch, just connection. We talked about their kids, their vacation plans, their thoughts on industry trends. It was the kind of conversation that happens between friends, not just business partners. They left telling me they couldn't imagine running their account without someone who understood their business so deeply. The exact words were, "Amanda just gets us in a way that's rare." I stored that comment away for later, knowing it would matter more than they realized in the coming months. That evening, I sent each of them a personalized follow-up email with small touches that showed I'd been listening. A restaurant recommendation for the marketing director's anniversary dinner. An article about college admissions for the CEO's daughter. A business contact who could help with their expansion plans. These weren't grand gestures. They were the small acts of attention that build unshakable loyalty over time. Chris could learn our processes, but he couldn't replicate 2 years of genuine care and attention to detail. Chris sent the Stevenson team an internal draft by mistake, one full of half-baked ideas and outdated data. The email was meant for Kevin, but Chris accidentally hit reply all on a client thread. The document revealed our internal profit margins, showed incomplete research, and included comments about their limited budget that were never meant for client eyes. The client was polite, but clearly concerned about the lack of professionalism and the breach of confidentiality. When they looped me in to fix the situation, I did so graciously, framing it as supporting the team during a busy transition period. I smoothed over the awkwardness with a combination of apology and distraction, redirecting their attention to exciting new campaign possibilities. Kevin praised me for the save, calling me a true team player in front of the entire department. Chris thanked me profusely, clearly embarrassed by his mistake. The irony was delicious. I was being celebrated for cleaning up a mess that actually served my larger strategy perfectly. Every time Chris stumbled, my value became more obvious, and he was stumbling frequently enough that people were starting to notice a pattern. By now, Stevenson had begun bypassing Chris entirely for anything important. They'd send him routine updates to be polite, but their real questions came directly to me. When they needed strategic advice, they called my line. When they had concerns about campaign performance, they scheduled time with me. Kevin started pushing for shared credit on all communications, insisting that Chris be copied on every email and included in every call. But the tone in Kevin's messages told me he was scrambling to find ways to make Chris look relevant to a client who'd already made their preference clear. I kept my head down and my work flawless. Every day, the balance tipped a little more in my favor. Chris was working harder than ever, staying late and coming in early, but effort without expertise was just visible desperation. The client could sense his uncertainty, and it made them uncomfortable. They wanted confidence and competence, not enthusiasm and good intentions. I gave them exactly what they needed, while Chris gave them reasons to worry about their account's future. 2 months after the dinner, Stevenson's CEO called me directly. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was reviewing campaign metrics when my phone rang. "Amanda, we need to discuss next year's contract," he said. "Can we set up a meeting for just the two of us?" My pulse quickened. This was the moment I'd been building toward, but I kept my voice steady and professional. "Of course. What would you like to discuss?" He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "We want to make sure you'll still be on our account. Your understanding of our business irreplaceable." I thanked him for the confidence and scheduled the meeting for the following week. After I hung up, I sat quietly at my desk for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The client wasn't just expressing a preference. They were drawing a line in the sand. Without saying it directly, they were telling me that their business relationship was with me personally, not with the agency. That phone call was my checkmate move, delivered without me having to lift a finger. When Stevenson sent over the renewal paperwork the following week, there was a new clause in black and white. Amanda Keene must remain primary contact, or the contract is void. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I didn't add it. I didn't even suggest it. They had done it themselves, unprompted. The clause was buried in the middle of the document, but its implications were crystal clear. If Kevin wanted to keep their $1 million account, he'd have to keep me in charge of it. Chris could have his promotion, but he couldn't have the thing that mattered most, the client that validated everything I'd built over 9 years. I forwarded the contract to Kevin with a simple note. Please review and let me know if you have any questions. I didn't highlight the clause or make any commentary about its significance. I trusted that he'd find it on his own and understand exactly what it meant. The ball was now entirely in his court, and every option he had was a losing one. He could accept the clause and admit that I was indispensable, or he could reject it and lose his biggest client. Either way, I'd won. The clause landed on our company's CEO's desk within hours. I was called into a meeting that I knew Kevin wasn't expecting. Our CEO, Patricia, had built the agency from nothing and understood the value of client relationships better than anyone. She congratulated me on the bond I'd built with Stevenson and said the client was non-negotiable. This is exactly the kind of partnership that builds our reputation, Patricia said, reviewing the contract terms. Whatever they need to feel confident about continuing with us, we provide. She announced that I'd be keeping the account and would report directly to her on all Stevenson-related matters. Kevin's face as he heard that decision was a memory I'll keep forever. He tried to argue that the change would disrupt team dynamics, but Patricia shut him down quickly. Team dynamics don't pay our rent, she said bluntly. Client satisfaction does. In less than an hour, the entire power structure had shifted. Chris could keep his promotion, but I'd just become untouchable. And Kevin knew it. A week later, a rival agency, one I'd quietly kept in touch with over the years, offered me a senior role with a 30% pay bump and equity in the company. They had heard about my success with Stevenson through industry connections and wanted someone who could bring that level of client relationship management to their growing business. But the real surprise came during the interview process. When I mentioned that I might be interested in making a move, they casually mentioned that Stevenson had already called them. The client had somehow learned about my potential departure and proactively reached out to say they'd move their business if I joined the new agency. I didn't have to think twice about the offer. This wasn't just a better job, it was validation that my work had value beyond any single company's politics. The new agency understood what Kevin had failed to grasp, that great client relationships are built by individuals, not institutions. They weren't just hiring me, they were investing in a proven track record of results, and they were willing to pay accordingly. I waited until the new contract was signed with Stevenson before handing in my notice. The timing was crucial. It meant Kevin had no leverage to negotiate or time to prepare a counter-strategy. I gave a professional, polite resignation letter with 2 weeks' notice, citing an opportunity for professional growth that aligns with my career goals. No accusations, no drama, just the quiet, lethal finality of walking away with his crown jewel. Kevin tried to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss my decision, but I was already mentally checked out. I'd made my choice based on careful calculation, not emotion. There was nothing he could say that would change my mind or undo the months of strategic positioning that had led to this moment. I spent those 2 weeks documenting everything I could about other accounts, being as helpful as possible to ensure smooth transitions. But when it came to Stevenson, I was clear that they'd made their preferences known in the contract. I wasn't abandoning the client, I was following their lead. They'd already told me exactly what they wanted, and it wasn't compatible with staying at my current company. Kevin insisted on taking me out for a farewell lunch on my last day. He chose the same restaurant where he delivered the promotion news 2 months earlier. I could see the irony wasn't lost on him as we sat at a similar table, the roles completely reversed from our last conversation there. He spent most of the meal asking if there was anything he could do to keep me. He offered a counter-promotion, a raise, more responsibility. But we both knew the real issue couldn't be solved with money or titles. He'd lost something more valuable than an employee. He'd lost credibility with his biggest client. I smiled, thanked him for all the opportunities over the years, and told him I was grateful for the clarity he'd given me that night at the restaurant. I watched the exact moment the memory hit him, saw him understand that this entire situation had started with his decision to overlook me for the promotion. His mistake had been thinking that dinner was an ending. Instead, it had been my beginning. Stevenson left the agency within a month of my departure. They fulfilled their contract terms by giving proper notice, but they made it clear that their decision was based on wanting to continue working with me specifically. Chris was reassigned to a smaller, less visible account where his learning curve wouldn't be so costly. Kevin lost his seat at the executive table when the agency had to explain to the board how they'd mishandled a $1 million client relationship. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing and retaining top talent. I never heard from either Kevin or Chris again, which was exactly how I wanted it. My new role was everything I'd wanted and more. The agency treated me as a partner, not just an employee. They understood that my value came from relationships and expertise that couldn't be easily replaced. More importantly, they created an environment where my success directly translated to their success. It was a partnership based on mutual respect, rather than corporate hierarchy. Looking back, I realized I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I chose the right battlefield. The promotion they denied me became irrelevant once I built something they couldn't take away. Instead of competing for Kevin's approval, I focused on earning the client's trust. Instead of trying to prove I deserved the position, I made the position depend on me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong, it's making their approval meaningless. Kevin thought he was managing a simple personnel decision, but he was actually creating his own downfall. Every choice he made to minimize my value only increased my motivation to demonstrate my worth elsewhere. That dinner changed everything, but not in the way Kevin intended. He thought he was closing a door, but he was actually opening a window. The promotion he gave Chris was temporary, but the client relationship I built was permanent. And that's exactly what I built my future on. Sometimes the biggest favor someone can do for you is to show you exactly how little they value what you bring to the table. Because that's when you know it's time to find a table that appreciates your worth.